So I'm Gigi, president of SFUAMB. I just want to talk a bit before we start the event. When I first joined this club, I had in mind a place where men, especially student-age men, could come and talk to other people who may have experienced the same thing that they have or who may have not. But at least they could come to a place where there would be no vilification or no judgment. Moreover, at this age, you're really expected to be ready for whatever life throws at you, and sometimes you just don't know what to do. For me, I have so many gender-based resources, which is great, but for men, there are next to no resources for issues related to their gender. So that's what this club is trying to change, which is why I'm so excited for tonight's event to have one of our very own student volunteers be at the forefront of our event. Before we get started, however, I'd like to invite our sponsor, Phil Johnston, Director of the Vancouver branch of the Canadian Association for Equality.
Thanks, Gigi. Thank you for coming out tonight. It's great to see a good turnout. And for those of you who don't know, the Canadian Association for Equality, or CAFE, is a registered charity that is dedicated to gender equality, and we're focused on raising awareness of issues men and boys face today, which include missing and murdered Indigenous men and boys, the underachievement of boys in education, high rates of suicide in the male population, and many more that our great featured presenter will be getting into tonight. Now, I'm excited about tonight's presentation for a very special reason, but those of you who have attended events before know I always say I'm excited, but I'm especially excited tonight because we get to hear from a group that has been, in a way, kind of the lifeblood of the Vancouver branch, which has been student advocates. SFUAMB, it's barely 2 years old, and this will be its 15th event that is raising awareness of men's issues. Can we please just give some applause for the students? So that's a ton of work they put into this, and I just want to say one other point is that I think you'll understand me when I say that it can be controversial and politically incorrect sometimes to talk about men's issues, but this is a group of students that you'll be hearing from tonight who has stepped up and basically said a very simple premise in a public forum such as this, is that the suffering of men is just as important and matters just as much as the suffering of other people. So I'm so glad that we're going to be hearing from them tonight. So I'm just going to say a few brief words about other upcoming events. So one of the things that the Vancouver branch has been working on is creating resources in the Vancouver region. So one of the things we've created is the Cafe Vancouver Legal Forum, and it is a pilot project where legal experts are connected with men facing legal issues. So if you're interested in attending that, the next one will be on Saturday, May 20th at 2 p.m. You can speak to me afterwards if you're interested, or if you know someone who might be interested. So the only other thing I'll say is that donations fuel our advocacy and help us start other advocacy for men and boys clubs on other campuses. We have one at the University of the Fraser Valley, and we're trying to get one started at UBC as well. Any donations that you can give tonight would be very appreciated. There will be envelopes on the table outside, and here's a little donation slip. If you fill it out in full, we can give you a tax receipt for any donation amount. And if you donate $5 or more, you will be entered into a draw to win, I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it's Sexual Paranoia on Campus. It's a new book by a feminist professor from Northwestern University named Laura Kipnis. It was just released at the beginning of this month. Apparently it's an amazing book and delves into sort of the culture of false accusations on various campuses in the United States. So if you donate $5 or more, you could win that book. Also, I'd like to encourage you to grab a cafe membership. Regular is $60, student is $20, and if you do grab a membership, you'll be able to attend our event coming up in May, which will feature an amazing speaker named Catherine Young. She's from the University of Victoria. She's written a book series with her co-author. His name is escaping me, but it's, pardon me? Paul Nathanson. No. But in any case, it's a series on misandry. She basically has brought that term into the fore in a way that's very important. So the name of her, it'll be basically an event entitled Trump Cards, misandry and misogyny in a new era. So anyway, I'll wrap that up. Thank you so much for your attention, and please enjoy the presentations.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So tonight's presentation will be approximately 45 minutes. Then we'll have a 10-minute break and then a question period. So it should end approximately 8:30 p.m. But first, before we start the event officially, we'll be welcoming SFUAMB's former president, Jesse Vitow, to the stage for a farewell address.
We've been working together for 2 years and you still can't say my name. Nobody can though. Yes, thank you everyone for coming. For those of you who don't know me, she just said my name, but it's Jesse Vitow. I am the, as of now, I guess, former president of SFUAMB. I have been the president for the last year, ever since Theron stepped down. The reason I'm stepping down is because today I handed in my undergraduate thesis, and I'm no longer a student at SFU. As you may notice, I'm a little bit less clean-shaven than I have been usually, and that's because I'm growing a beard to prepare for the winters of Toronto, where I'm doing my graduate studies in physics in the fall. I don't want to freeze. I still remember when my friend from math actually came up to me and mentioned that there was a nascent club being formed at SFU to deal with men's issues. I had been involved on campus in men's issues for a few years before that in a kind of unsatisfying way, because the only avenue for that was run by a coalition of the Women's Center and the LGBT coalition. So it wasn't quite what I was looking for. I contacted the people involved, showed up at the first meeting and basically said, give me some position, give me something to do, I'll do anything, I just want to help. At that time, I was already a member of Student Council, the president of the Physics Student Association, and the vice president external of the Science Undergraduate Society, so it wasn't likely that I took on more responsibilities. Very quickly, I became the vice president of the club, and when Theron stepped down, the president. And when we first started, it was a much different world when it came to men's issues. Even in 2 short years, a lot has changed. We've expanded to 2 other campuses, one unofficially, UBC, and the other is the University of the Fraser Valley, which we have set up a club, I think 6 months ago now with Jaylene. And yes, we are continuously looking to support other people trying to form clubs all over Canada. We've had contact from the people at Ryerson, as well as other men's issues awareness clubs. One at University of Toronto, which I will be involving myself with when I get there. Yes. Being a member of this club and running it has been an incredibly valuable experience to me. It's helped me lead to discover new political views for myself, new ideologies, and new ways of expressing ideas in a palatable manner that actually convinces people of their veracity. I've made friends through this work that I fully expect to last a lifetime, if they can remember my name. As this part of my life ends, I have been reflective on the work that we've done together over the last 2 years and where it is going. The men in our society suffer needlessly. This is not a zero-sum game where the benefits to men need to come at the deficits of women. This isn't to say that there aren't injustices of exactly that type, but that by raising awareness of things like male suicide, male genital mutilation, workplace death, and the lack of mental health support, we can create a tide that lifts all boats. More complicated societal issues such as bias in the courts, criminal and civil, as well as parental alienation and underperformance in schools need to be addressed carefully yet firmly. As I mentioned, the world of men's issues was a much different place 2 years ago. We had to be much more subdued about the way we spoke about these issues, and more careful to couch what we were saying in the dominant viewpoints on campus so as to avoid censure. This is no longer the case today, and we can clearly say publicly that men face issues in our society and receive mainstream support. For example, Cafe is entered in the BMO marathon, which is amazing. We are winning this battle of ideas, and our ammunition is facts and the dedication of volunteers, like the team you see here today. There is still, however, a long way to go. We need to be vigilant about the quality of our arguments and the veracity of our sources, as we have been for the last 2 years and beyond for people who have been involved longer. We need to continue to work towards amicable relationships with our ideological opponents on campus and abroad. And we have to continue the outreach to young men and women who are coming of age in this society. This is where you all come in. Everyone has something that they can give, be it your time, your expertise, contacts you have who have skills, financial aid in the form of donations, or even a few kind words to people like Phil, who basically works a full-time job doing activism. There are surely those of you who have considered getting involved but fear the repercussions. I'd like to tell an anecdote. A while back, I had gotten into a bit of an argument with a mutual friend, a friend of mine, about male suicide and how that needed to be addressed. And it got a bit heated, which was probably my fault, but at the end of it, after it had died down and the debate had finished, one of my male friends came up to me and he mentioned, he asked me if I ever felt annoyed or upset that when I was standing up there arguing against 3 or 4 people, if it ever bothered me that men who I knew who agreed with me weren't standing up and agreeing and publicly letting people know that they thought that what I was saying had value. And I told him that it didn't bother me because each of us has to choose our own battles to fight. I think that this one is worthwhile, and I thought it was worthwhile in that moment, but I don't begrudge anyone saying I'd rather save my capital for another day. But the only thing I do begrudge is when those who are willing to get involved let the opportunity pass them by because of uncertainty. Each one of us has the capacity to extend compassion to men in need, both societally and in our life. In your own life, through volunteering and by attending these events and convincing your friends to come, you can affect a lot of change. I'm quite excited to hand this off to Gigi, and I think that in the coming years, SFUMB will do well without me at its helm. Thank you all for making the work I've done over these years so rewarding, and continue to fight for the change we know is necessary. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jesse. So now for our featured presenter. The first time he met with us, he made it clear he wanted to speak up about men's issues, which is just the kind of enthusiasm our community needs when it's so often misunderstood and mischaracterized. A 21-year-old undergraduate criminology student at SFU, this is his first year being involved with the club. He is currently working as a paralegal at a law firm. He's passionate about promoting and advocating for male mental health and legal issues, and we're excited to have him share his ideas. His talk is entitled The War Against Boys and Men. Please join me in welcoming Sue Lee.
So first off, I'd like to say that it's wonderful to have such a great turnout. I'm so excited that everybody has deemed it worthwhile to actually listen to me talk, whereas the environment on campus has been less than stellar in the past. I've got a lot to say to you guys today, but first off, we need to acknowledge that we live in a society where everybody has equal rights. We have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and in this way, I want to frame today's talk as not of one of males' rights or female rights, but one of issues. Instead of addressing what we already have, we need to look at what we don't have and what perhaps we're lacking a bit, and perhaps how the youth and the male youth of today are growing up without the kind of support that you or maybe me had back then. So I'd like to start this off with a very, very prominent quote that many of you guys may have heard before, and it's by a famous US Senator or Secretary of State named Hillary Rodham Clinton. So we all have our views on her, but that's for another day. Now the quote is, "Women have always been the primary victims of war. They lose their husbands, their fathers, and their sons in combat." Now, if you don't see the implications behind this, think a little bit harder at what that implies. Women are the primary victims of war. Now, whether Senator Clinton simply misspoke or was going for dramatic effect is beyond the point here. The point is that this sort of kind of doublethink is very much prevalent in our society today with regards to male issues. That male issues, when they are brought up, are overshadowed by other issues. And that's not necessarily good because when you don't bring it to the forefront, nobody actually addresses it. So it could be a simple misstatement, but it's actually rather ironic. It's an indication of the attitude we have towards issues affecting men and boys. It's an invisible attitude. They don't exist. In fact, it's framed in a way that places more emphasis on women's issues rather than men's issues. I mean, a good joke of mine was, it's a rather dark joke, that if you wanted to take a look at what male privilege looked like, you can go to Arlington National Cemetery. That's what male privilege looks like, honestly. But society does mask the issues faced by men and women in several ways. For instance, when I'd like to bring up boys' issues, how young boys are going through this phase where they're struggling to develop a masculine identity, opponents quickly counter with this notion that there's male privilege. Well, just because there's male privilege, or even if there is such a concept, doesn't mean that there's not issues suffered by that particular class of people. Even the most dominant groups in society do have weaknesses, and they do have issues that very much need to be addressed. And as much as you can bury your head in the sand and pretend to be an ostrich, the fact is that an overwhelming majority of men are killing themselves each day, and an overwhelming majority are addicted to substance abuse, and they're suffering from invisible mental health issues. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at. Now, one thing that I really do have an issue with is how we as men do not talk. And you will see that this is a recurring theme throughout my speech, and especially at the end too. So just let me to hammer that in now, that we as men don't necessarily communicate enough, and as kind of a society that values this camaraderie and brotherhood and this teamwork, I don't quite see it too often. And I think that's an issue that we all need to address, and we all need to promote it a bit more. In society, we are also taken for granted. This will sound controversial, and I'm sure that somebody will find a way to snip that little bit out and make it seem like I'm a huge misogynist. But what I mean we're taken for granted is that in the context of, say, workplace deaths, when you have a workplace death, it's not viewed as a male issue, it's viewed as a workplace issue. Well, I agree that the highly disproportionate statistics of male fatalities in the workplace versus females should necessitate we viewing it as a male issue. And same goes for the draft, it goes for combat deaths, and it goes for a lot of the injuries and dangers that we face. So that's another point of my talk today here, is that however much you approach these issues, we want to look at it from a male perspective, because if you look at it from a male perspective, we can find solutions that are tailored to men in this regard. We need a balanced, equality-based approach. Every group has disadvantages, but even if male dominance, once again, is per se a phenomenon, it does not mean that there are problems that need to be addressed. And I'm going to touch on a few of them just briefly today. So the first thing I'm going to look at today is what I like to call the demasculinization of young men and boys. I'm not promoting this hyper-masculine, alpha male kind of mentality amongst young boys. Not necessarily saying that's bad, but I firmly believe that each young man and boy should be able to choose how to develop their own personality. But to illustrate my point here, I'd like to use a case in point. You guys might have seen on the news a few years ago that a boy in America was suspended from school because he chewed a cookie in the shape of a gun. Very true. And recently another boy was suspended because he found a .22 caliber shell casing in his backyard and decided to take us to school for a show and tell. He was promptly suspended. Now, what I see behind these two issues is not just, say, society being squeamish about these. It's more about society demonizing these masculine traits that tend to emerge. I'm sure many of you guys, when you were younger, you drew tanks, you drew stickmen fighting each other and such. I did too, and it's quite a normal aspect of exploration. Boys will play with toy soldiers, they will play with trucks and such. But we see nowadays that this is no longer acceptable, and we're starting to push for this approach that gets rid of these traditionally masculine activities. Now, my issue is that this discourages a lot of the traits and the personality quirks that are necessary for young boys to become assertive men in the future. Things like playing contact sports or combat sports at a young age are discouraged. Interest in things like combat, firearms, that's discouraged. Now, you may well argue that this is perhaps not a bad thing, but I don't think that anybody should be in a business of telling children what not to be interested in and what to be, as long as it's within the bounds of being safe. And of course, you can teach many of these topics and encourage them to learn in a safe manner. Now, the common rationale that the media actually has behind this is the one of school shootings. You hear this over and over again. You have a youth, he has an interest in guns, he has an interest in firearms, he has an interest in violence, and he's a school shooter. That's not really the case here, is it? If that was true, if we look at the profile of school shooters, they're not typical type A masculine men with a kind of an aggressive alpha male personality. No, these kids, these young men, are typically those who are ostracized by their peers, they have poor parental support, and they show poor emotional development, and they're not getting the support they need, and they lash out. It has nothing to do with the kind of hyper-masculine environment the opponents of what we're fighting for believe in. It doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with a lack of emotional support, plain and simple. These youth are inherently misunderstood, and while I'm not excusing what they did as correct, I'm saying it could have been preventable had we had the right mentality from the start. The solution isn't to ban violent video games like Grand Theft Auto, or teach kids not to fight in response to a bully, or discourage them from exploring interests in, say, firearms or football or some other violent activity. The solution is to reach out, and it's to extend them a helping hand when they need it. You can't expect a 14, 15, 16-year-old male to know what's going on in his head when he's not feeling right. And you certainly can't expect him to know when he's got no friends at school, or if his mom and dad aren't there for him. So what I like to just wrap this part of my talk up with is that we see the demasculinization of young boys, and not just in a traditional manner either. We're demasculinizing them by removing the traditional sources of support they have, peers, family, and we're encouraging these traits that don't promote an assertive personality. The media conflates assertiveness with aggressiveness. If you're assertive, you're being aggressive. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think many of us, lay people, can easily tell the difference between assertive and aggressive. And there's a time for both of them. But to lump them all under the umbrella of being aggressive and hypermasculine and remove it, it doesn't bode well for anything. Now, the second issue that may be a bit more relevant to the people in this room is the legal system. So this tends to affect men slightly over the age of 25. And the one aspect of the legal system I'm going to talk about today have to do with the family law courts. So a bit of backstory here. Early on in the 70s or 80s, I forgot, I didn't do too well in family law. There was a case called Moj versus Moj, and it's the defining case in the Canadian legal system. And I have the quote right here. In Moj versus Moj, the courts essentially ruled that the consequences resulting from the breakdown of a marriage should be proportionately distributed between both parties. Now that sounds pretty well-intentioned, doesn't it? Well, that's not the case in court today. That's not how exactly it's been carried out. Contrast this with a very recent development in the news that I saw. So a man, his name has not been disclosed, actually committed suicide as a result of the proceedings he had to endure in family court. He left a suicide note that reads, "Family law needs reform. I recommend mandated lower costs and less reward for false claims of abuse. Parental alienation is devastating. I love my children as much as a husband and father could. I see no light. I recommended an authority consistent during high conflict separations. It is exploited in family law." This individual had owed his wife a total of $6,500 in spousal support a month. That's more than the income of most people in this room. I think that's ridiculous. I'm not sure where the judges got that number from. But if the judges are following the decision in that Supreme Court of Canada case in any means, then obviously there's something going on here. There's something systemic that is causing them to award these high amounts of spousal support where it's clearly not necessitated. And my view on it is that when they're looking at the consequences resulting from the breakdown of the marriage, they're not looking at the financial consequences on the husband. Sure, there's consequences for the wife, such as the loss of the breadwinner, the loss of the family home, and the loss of many resources that they would otherwise have. But marriage is a joint venture, and the same thing happens to the husband as well. And more often than not, there's this pre-existing conception that the husband has to pay. And my issue is that the judges in the family law courts don't necessarily see eye to eye with the average husband. They don't understand how much they make. They don't understand what their pre-existing financial obligations are. And they tend to award amounts that are theoretically normal, but in practicality are impossible to meet, such as the $6,500 a day or a month. That adds up to, I'm not too good on my math, $5,000 a month for 12 months, that's over $60,000. That's above the median income in Canada. You're asking a man to give his entire income to a woman he's no longer with on the basis that he should be obligated to support her for the breakdown in marriage. I don't see any reciprocal undertaking here. And especially, I don't see how any man could pay that much money and expect to retain his dignity and support himself. If the consequences of marriage are to be distributed evenly, so should the benefits. And right now, we're only seeing a one-way street. The other thing with the family law courts that is more of geared towards the younger males of today are the resources that are available for teenage fathers. Now, this may seem like a novel concept because it is actually, but you see, it ties into a larger picture of how there's many more resources for women who face family law issues versus men. The example I'm going to use is actually MTV. This might seem a bit ridiculous, but you see MTV has a TV show called, it's something to do with teenage moms, right? We don't see the same thing for teenage dads. Now, I'm not advocating that teenage dads should get their own TV show. I think that'd be a disaster in every single way possible. But what I'm asking is for the creation of at least some resources to help teenage fathers who are willing to be there and care for their children to have the resources to do so. If you deprive a child of one of the most important figures in their life, a father figure, doesn't matter how old they are, it doesn't turn out well for the child. We're in the interest of encouraging healthy development, male or female. And in this case, I think it would do well for the male father to have that vested amount of support. And if we give them those support structures, I think that societal acceptance will follow after, and that teenage fathers won't be looked on with that kind of, what are we talking about? Right? We hear about teenage mothers all the time, teenage pregnancy. Well, I think teenage fatherhood should be recognized as well if we are to encourage young men who do make that decision to be accountable for it. But yet, when you give them accountability, you also have to give them the resources to do so. I think that's important. And I don't know if there's anybody here who did have a kid when they were 18 to 20, but if you did, probably wish you had this stuff, didn't you? I know if I got my girlfriend pregnant right now, God forbid, I wouldn't be able to make it, which is why this is extra important. Now, the third topic I'm going to talk about is more something that you might have seen on your way here. All right, I don't know if you guys have guessed it yet, but I'm here to talk about homelessness. Now, as I talked about it earlier, we can look at things from a human perspective, we can look at things from a people perspective, but we're going to look at it from a male perspective here. And when you look at homelessness from a male perspective, it's a lot different than if you look at it from, say, a societal perspective. One of the other interesting statistics I've happened on in my many years on this earth is this one. Women comprise 20% of the homeless population. I've heard that one in many variations over time, and it's all to draw emphasis to the fact that women account for 25% of all the homeless persons out there. Just like that quote from Hillary Clinton, this implies something else, right? And this implication is not immediately apparent, because if it was, it wouldn't be published. But if we look at it, the invisible 75% of homeless persons are men. When you look at a homeless male, you don't think that he's a man. He's not. He's stripped of his dignity, and you're not viewing any solution to that in a male manner. Male homeless persons typically suffer not only from a loss of economic consequences, but also from a loss of dignity, from not being able to provide for himself to being a shell of the person he was. These aren't just random people you see on the street. They're not human pigeon. This is somebody's father, it could be somebody's brother, it could be somebody's uncle or son. And these are very much people that need help. And they're not getting it. They're not getting that kind of tailored support that conforms to their gender identity. I don't like using the word gender identity, but it's particularly appropriate right now, because we're not seeing a specialized response to male homelessness. Another thing that I'd like to note is that for the homeless, we also have to look at the minority population for male homeless persons. So Aboriginal. Philip talked about missing Aboriginal men earlier. You hear a lot about missing Aboriginal women in the media, and I think that's highly important. We got to do something about that. But if we are to truly strive for equality, there should be something done on the flip side to missing and murdered Aboriginal men. It's not healthy to encourage saving one gender over the other. We're not in that interest. And if the resources do exist, we should pool them evenly to address the other issue. And if the resources are not there, We should take the initiative to create it. Because as Bush said, no child should be left behind, and although the program was a disaster in every way, I firmly believe that no man or boy should be left behind. We need to create support structures for them, and we're also in the interest of promoting their health. The male homeless problem is a very, very, I'm going to use the word invisible again. It's an invisible issue. I'm going to use the anecdote. One time I was walking down the street, and this was before I really became conscious of these issues. There was a homeless girl and a homeless guy. Can you guess which one I gave money to? The homeless girl. Why? Because I got so used to seeing male homeless that they just became a part of the background. So when I saw a woman that was homeless, I gave money to them. That isn't to say that she didn't deserve it. She definitely deserves the help. But so do the other 10 or dozen so men on that street right then who also needed help, yet were ignored by virtue of their gender. And I don't agree with that. I think that all men deserve the help if they don't have it. As men, we have a responsibility to other men. We have a responsibility to look out for their welfare, and we have a responsibility to extend a helping hand. This sort of camaraderie and brotherhood shouldn't just come about in times of war or extreme duress. It should be commonplace. Suicides don't just happen in times of duress, they happen daily. Homelessness occurs daily. Losing battles in family court occur daily. And finally, young boys who are told to be less of a boy or less of a man in elementary school happens daily. It shouldn't have to take a stressful event or a time of emergency or time of war even to trigger that kind of brotherhood that we are all capable of. That's not necessary, and that's going too far. If you have to take it that far, it's probably already too late. So if we can take anything away from these 3 points here, it all comes down to one question. What can we do to encourage healthy male mental and emotional development? And what way can we mobilize the resources needed for this? Well, let me ask you a question, and just show me with a raise of hands. When was the last time you called a male friend who you haven't heard in a while and asked him, "Hey buddy, are you okay?" So out of all the about 20 of you in the room, only a few people have done that. And that's the issue right there. People aren't looking out for each other. And I'm not trying to criticize you guys or anything, and I'm not trying to put anybody down. Because many of you guys weren't even conscious of this in the first place. It takes having to see somebody commit suicide in the local paper or news to realize maybe what they've been going through. And as men, especially as independent men who strive to be successful, we find it increasingly hard to acknowledge that we might need help once in a while. And for those of you who do make it and become successful and mentally well off, you find it hard to consciously visualize the need to help others who may not have achieved that same level of self-actualization. And that's a very, very dangerous ground to tread on. Because when people are isolated within their own path of success, you see the distribution we have today. You have a lot of males who make it up there, they're mentally well off, and you have the ones that don't, but there's a gap between them. There's nothing linking them. There's nothing to help these guys rise to up there, and there's nothing to remind the guys up there of what other people are going through. So it goes back to the lack of hands raised I saw earlier, is that it goes down to the very, very personal level, where all it takes is a simple question and a desire to be frank and forthcoming with each other. I'm going to ask you for another raise of hands. I earlier asked you how many times you said to somebody else, "Hey man, are you okay?" I want those of you to raise your hand if somebody else has asked you if you were okay. I see a lot more hands. Okay, so this goes back to the whole reciprocal thing I talked about earlier. It's not going back and forth, right? If you have some part of the male population helping each other out, but the other part isn't pulling its own weight, then that distribution I talked about earlier, it comes back. So if there's anything you guys can take away from my talk today, it's that you need to help each other out. We're all the same gender here, some exceptions, but everybody is welcome to help. Okay, and I think it's important that as men, we develop that same sort of brotherhood that has been prevalent throughout many, many centuries. It doesn't have to just exist in an army. You don't have to go to the armed forces to find it. You should be able to find it all around you. However, as much as helping others is important, there is one thing that is even more important, that's self-care. I'm going to use the analogy of a flight here. How many of you guys have ever been on a plane? Raise your hand. Great, so you guys know the procedure, right? The flight attendant comes on and says, your oxygen mask is in the aisle above your head. Make sure you help yourself before you help your child, right? Because if the plane loses altitude and the oxygen level drops in there immediately, you got to put your own oxygen mask on before you help a little junior beside you, because if you pass out, what good is that going to do him or her? And that's the same analogy for mental health. You got to get self-help first. You got to be able to realize that there is something wrong, and you got to help yourself before you can go help somebody else or seek help from somebody else. I've noted this earlier and I'll note it again. Being conscious of your issues is key. This means you got to acknowledge the vulnerabilities you may have as a man. You got to acknowledge your shortcomings, and although that is painful and sometimes even humiliating, it's essential. If you don't know what cracks there are in your mental and your emotional health, then how can you patch them, right? You keep building on top of that cracked foundation, and one day it's all going to come down on you, and then that day may be too late to salvage. And I think that's another one of the issues we face, that we're not ready to acknowledge failure. When doubt seeps in, you got two roads. You can take either road. You can go to the left, or you can go to the right. And believe me, people will tell you all the time. Your fathers will tell you, your mothers will tell you, society will tell you that failure is not an option. That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Failure is always an option. Now listen closely. Failure is always an option, but an option is a choice. You can choose to fail, or you can choose to succeed. And it may take time and repeated attempts, but eventually you will make it if you persevere. And if we can let young boys know that the path to success is through acknowledging yourself, keeping your chin up, placing one foot after the other and taking slow incremental steps, and seeking help, then we can set him on the path to success. Or we can deprive him of emotional supports. We can deprive him of that friendship network that is so needed for development. And that's how self-doubt and negative talk seeps in. But failure is there, and it's important to acknowledge that. And as men, especially young men, we hate to acknowledge the fact that we fail. It's humiliating, it feels self-defeating, and it's not something that we would readily share with somebody else, because we're afraid of what they say to us. But if you don't say anything, if you don't take that risk of being humiliated, there's no chance of getting help. That's important. Because although we're strong individuals, we're capable of many great things, there are some things that we just do need help on. And there's nothing wrong with a manly attitude. There's nothing wrong with a self-sufficient manly attitude. But you want to emphasize self-actualization. I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yep, everybody's taking first year psychology, right? We're glad that's over. But what you want to emphasize in your hierarchy of needs is toughness and mental and emotional fortitude. So in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to reach self-actualization, you got to pass a number of certain steps, make sure some prerequisites are there. I think another one of the prerequisites that should be added in the context of male mental health is taking care of yourself first. It's mental health. It's taking care of yourself and asking for help. It goes back to the questions I asked you earlier. The first question I asked, only about 2 or 3 of you guys raised their hands. Second one, many of you raised their hands. So many of you have maybe received help or received offers of help, but haven't extended that same offer. And in the terms of visualizing it on a hierarchy of needs, you're missing something important there. You're missing the other part, and that may prevent a lot of you guys from reaching that stage of being a man that we all aspire to. Now, the one caveat I do want to add in my speech is I'm not telling you guys how to be a man. I think there's many ways to be men in the 21st century, and I think a lot of them are all equally acceptable as long as they are, not destructive towards yourself or others. And I encourage everybody to find what defines them as a man, what activities do so, what kind of traits do so, or what kind of reflections gives you your masculine identity. And once you realize that, life becomes infinitely much easier when you know who you are. Just think of it as a character in a video game. Start by putting a couple points in different statistics and in different traits. And if you don't have the right character, the start of the game, the middle of the game, and the end of the game is pretty damn hard. It's like you put the difficulty slider all the way to the other side. So it's important to find those traits and those abilities that really make up a masculine identity and maximize them as a whole. This helps you throughout life, and more importantly, it allows you to help others. There's one quote that I want to finish off with here, and it's from a play by Shakespeare called Henry V. Some of you guys might be familiar with that if you're a fan of classic literature. Honestly, I'm not. I have no idea what Shakespeare is. I think I read Romeo and Juliet in grade 9, and that was it. It was terrible. But the quote is right here, and I think it's particularly important to link to the theme of my talk so far. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Now that quote might sound rather grand and somewhat morbid, but that's not the way I want to take this quote. The way I want to take this quote is, you don't have to shed blood to be in a band of brothers. It doesn't have to go that far. Whether it be war or taking your own life, you don't need that amount of stress to be able to experience that kind of camaraderie and come together as a man. There's no need to share blood. You help each other before it gets that far. And it all starts when one person reaches out and asks, hey, are you okay? And that person who he reached out to will do the same to another and another. And that's how we form that network, and that is how we're going to improve this next generation of men. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, so much for that wonderful presentation. We're just going to take a minute short break.
How long was that?
7:19. I think you started at 6:30, so it was about like
45 minutes. Felt a lot shorter.
it was actually because you started at like 6:20, like 6:30. You started, but there was a couple of talks, so
Try to keep that under 30 minutes.
yeah, it was 30 minutes.
Great.
Pretty good.
It's funny, I introduce him to a lot of my friends and they don't know what to do with him. And then the second time they meet him, he's a completely different person. It's true though, it's true. He even told me, like he told me, what was it, the first time you meet somebody, he throws everything at you. He'll throw the world at you just to see how you cope, right? His view of the world. And then the second time you meet him, he's like, chill. And I've seen it, and it's amazing.
Alrighty, we're gonna get started now.
See.
Have our question period. So instead of lining up at a mic, we'll just have you guys stay where you are. I just want to remind you guys that you can donate to cafe at the table outside. So if you want to do that, do that. Anyways, I'll let Tony take over now for the questions.
Hello everybody, I hope you had a good break, whatever that is to you. So I'll be happy to take some questions for you guys. How it's going to work is you ask a question, I'll rephrase it for the mic and for the camera, and then I'll try my best to answer. In the interest of free speech and full and frank public discourse, I welcome any and all questions. It's your discretion what you consider appropriate. I will, of course, be adhering to guidelines, but I would like to answer as full and frank as possible. So, floor is open. Gentleman right there.
Being a man in this context, I think it's all Chinese who's not afraid of a cut of 10,000? No, who's not afraid of the 10,000 cuts dares to unhorse the empire? That's about the power of I'm sorry that scares some people out, but it can be a hobby. Okay, my question now, you talk about double thing before. I love how we have very good reading. You heard of FIFA, so Chinese FIFA.
I'm not quite following, sir.
It's okay. You're talking about it very exactly. Well, in Taiwan, FIFA is reinterpreted. It's difficult to answer because it has a special meaning. If you're dealing with someone high, with a party, and people, they do that very much. You're going to tell them something that you don't like, and they're going to repeat it to you until almost exactly the same. There's a tiny thing missing, and that tiny thing is your main message. That's FIFA. So, a good example, there's also the ball band by Fraser University Advocacy. Have heard of it?
No, sir.
I'm getting that. The ball band is, you do it, you're a band, you don't go down. So, my question is about the Article 15 of you said the Constitution said that we are equal.
Yes, that would be Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the equality provision.
And that we have as read before, I've been saying that since the late 80s. 15.1 says the paragraph 2 of 15 says if you want, some are more equal than others. And I do believe that that's when the whole process equality has been discussed, and it changed completely. FIFA when they interpret of the term. We talk equality, but equality is not really equality anymore. And my question is about C14. You heard of C14?
That's the new bill being introduced in Parliament, correct?
Where I think we're heading now, it's about the question, please. I mean, it's the alignment between the, I mean, like you were talking about. So my question is, how do you this? Maybe you're not trying to answer the I want you to answer, but I mean, the government can kill people now, and that will have. So how do you think that might affect, given what you said about the Roman institution? Because I myself feel that because they complain. Poor men alone on the street will die faster soon. Do you see what I mean?
Sir, I'm afraid I don't quite follow your line of reasoning.
Okay, secret 14 says that.
Okay, we're gonna try sir the back.
Oh, that's good. I've been part of numerous groups, organizations for 30 years now. There's a lot of men in Vancouver that are networked and connected to one another. It's been a hugely enriching part of my life, and it's been kind of a refuge for me at times when I needed refuge. It's so good in every way. It's no small feat to overcome men's innate competitiveness. Yeah, I don't think I'm being too anthropological when I point out that it's kind of a gene that's pretty prevalent in us and operative whether we want it to be or not. How do you, in your mind, how do you overcome that? Because that's really, in my view, what keeps men from joining up and really connecting with one another.
So the question phrase was how does the male capacity or innate predisposition towards competitiveness prevent men from connecting with each other? I don't think the problem here should be removing that competitive gene per se. I think competitiveness is healthy because it encourages growth. However, I think competitiveness should be tempered with, say, collaboration. Now, if it's biological, that is a whole different animal in itself. But I think that as social beings, we can also encourage collaboration. And if we can temper competitiveness with collaboration and perhaps have this sort of competitiveness where it's not for the purpose of one-upping each other, but for the purpose of improvement, then we can go there. But I certainly do not want to discourage young men and boys from not being competitive, because that's what makes great men out of adolescent youth and boys. Gentleman in back, yes.
Actually, to that question. You started out by talking about a quote from Hillary Clinton about the victims of war in Arlington Cemetery and talking about the draft, and then you later criticized the trend towards suppressing males from playing with guns and stuff as being bad, but maybe it's a feminist argument, but I believe one of the arguments about suppressing those kinds of gun-related, war-related, what do you call it, mentality in boys is somehow going to discourage the idea of sending boys to war, etc., or sending men to war. So I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile the two?
That's an excellent question, actually. So the question was there, how can we reconcile the my assertion that perhaps we need to encourage some of these more typically masculine and aggressive traits and activities in boys with the argument that perhaps we shouldn't have boys being sent to war and sent to the draft? That's a really good question, actually. And the way I'm going to say it is that the draft is something mandatory, that we shouldn't encourage boys to go to war. That's a decision they can make as adults. And if boys want to play with G.I. Joe, if they want to play with toy guns when they're younger, I don't think we should discourage that, even if it leads to the risk of them wanting to join the armed forces later, which incidentally is, in my point of view, a noble, it's a noble form of work, I like to say. I do not like war. I don't think anybody here likes war. I don't think anybody should be sending our men to fight. But we do need to recognize that some of these men, if there's no draft, would be volunteering to do so, and we shouldn't discourage them from that, because individual autonomy is also a big part of being a man. Being able to make that choice, saying, I will put my life on the line for my country. This is what I believe in, and this is what I want to do. And I think that's important. So, of course, we can warn them. We can give them the stark reality of how it is, but let them make the decision in the end. And having young boys perhaps take that risk of being predisposed to, say, these ideas of war, ideas of combat, is a risk that personally I would be willing to take as a father, and it's how I grew up too. I grew up drawing tanks and guns and stuff. I grew up playing cowboys and Indians, and I think I turned out pretty well. Yes, Jesse.
So you talked about and forming support networks, where you asked us, have we ever reached out to a man, have we ever been reached out to? So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you see that fitting in with the kind of classical stoic model of male mental health, as well as how you balance reaching out when you need to with the very real social consequences of appearing as in need and mentally unstable as a man, which will, in a lot of cases, immediately lower your value in a lot of situations.
That's a very good question as well. That's not something that's going to happen quickly. The whole stoic male mentality is one that's not going to disappear within one generation or even two. It's something that's been bred, it's something that's been encouraged and developed over many centuries and throughout many different cultures, that males need to be this strong, silent, and stoic figure. However, males are not perfect, and cracks do show, and even the most stoic of us do have events occur in our lives that can shake us. I want to work on changing this. I'm not necessarily saying that we should all be, emotional, crazy, irrational people. Stoicism isn't bad, but it's also bad when you take it to the extent that you believe you have no weaknesses and you ignore the small signs or danger signs that do show up. So to answer your question, a support network would require generational change first. We would need to begin with the next generation of male youth and teach them that, yes, being strong and silent is not necessarily a bad thing that needs to be discouraged. But if they are unsure, there is no shame, there is no humiliation, no shame, and there is no stigma associated with asking a brother for help. You can frame it in the way of looking out for a buddy. I tend to find that when males are told to work as a team in order to look out for their brother or to look out for their friend, they become a lot more responsive to not only giving help, but also accepting help. But if you frame it in a way that says, hey, if you're feeling vulnerable, if you're feeling weak, you can go get help, that they don't really like it. It doesn't jive well with them. So we want to encourage them in a positive rather than negative fashion of telling them to act like a brotherhood, encourage that camaraderie, almost have a wolf pack of sorts, rather than say on a clinical patient psychiatrist basis, because nobody wants to admit they need help.
So you talked about how males play with guns and things like that, draw tanks, what have you. So do you discourage males from doing artsy things, doing feminine things, so like dressing up in a dress or putting on makeup or wearing heels when they're boys, and then later on finding out that potentially they might be gay? Do you discourage this at all, or?
Absolutely not. That's male identity. I think you consideration in any form of young male activity is autonomy. I believe that a boy should have the choice to choose what he plays with. If he gravitates towards a toy tank or a toy rifle, good for him. If he gravitates towards an easy bake oven or a ballerina dress or other form of traditionally feminine toys, great for him. You want to encourage that. You want to tell him there's nothing wrong with that. So when he grows up to be a healthy man. That's important. I don't want to have a traditionally lumped or stereotypical definition of masculinity. That's everything I fought against. I think that out of the perhaps 3.5 billion males on this earth, there are 3.5 billion distinct masculine identities, and each one of them are worth their own weight, essentially. I don't want to create this, say, prima facie conceptualization of what masculinity is. If a boy gravitates towards the arts, we want to encourage that. We want to make sure he's a great artist. We want to make sure he grows up confident in what he does and that he is good in what he does. So when he is in a moment of emotional duress, he has something to fall back on. He has an identity that serves as the bedrock for whatever support system he develops. So to answer your question, absolutely not. I would encourage any sort of healthy male development, regardless of existing stereotypes. Question?
Your most favorite and least favorite aspect in terms of male psychology that you found useful or not useful in your military time?
Well, generally, I don't like to talk about my military service just because of policy considerations with the Canadian Armed Forces. From what I have experienced, I say the most encouraging aspect is the one I've been talking about: teamwork, looking out for a buddy. You learn to see that it's much more than just you. It's your team versus yourself. Service before self doesn't just extend to your country, it extends to the men around. In your family, it extends to your uncles, your brothers, your sons, and your fathers. But in the outside, it can extend to the male coworkers, it can extend to your friends, and even to your acquaintances when they need them. And in times of emergency, complete strangers. My least favorite aspect of male psychology is perhaps the more extremist factions who feel like they're owed something. I don't necessarily think that anybody is owed something, but I do think that some groups some groups have to work a lot harder than others to get what they need, if you understand. So what we're talking about here is resolving disadvantages rather than straight up giving them what they're fighting for. Because I don't agree with that either. I think everybody should work for what they think they should have, but if one group is working disproportionately hard to get at a resource they should have, that's not something right. But the attitude of entitlement has to go, because it doesn't help the cause, it simply hurts it, and it opens it up for ridicule. Question?
First, so I'm a cabinet maker apprentice, and I work in our architectural manufacturing company, which is a fancy word for cabinet making company. We have about 20 people on the floor, including me. I happen to be the only girl in the workshop. So I get to use the bathroom by myself, which is pretty cool, but. So what I've been noticing is that people are eager to help me a lot more than other people, even though some may be less experienced than me or have less education than me. For example, if I'm about to lift something, half the time someone will automatically rush to my help, even though I have lifted this exact thing before. It's like, and then the one guy did it so much that I eventually had to tell him to back off in an aggressive or assertive way, whichever you want to prefer it. And by then, he finally backed off. And my boss is a lot less inclined to give me difficult tasks that I had to ask for it to actually receive it. And so my question is, or my theory is, I think this may be some protected instinct of some sort. I looked up on the Google and I don't know, all sorts of article published that the males have the instinct to protect females all the time. What do you think of that?
I'm going to answer your question with another question.
Is this instinct really a biological instinct, or is it some sort of condition that society has instilled in men that they need to be the protectors and servants of the greater good? What do you think? Do you think it's...
Second, I like to believe the nurture over nature, and nurture can overcome nature. So I think it's definitely conditioned, and it pisses me off, but that's my problem, and it's their problem. They're automatically inclined to do that. That if everyone's doing that, there must be something interesting going on over there.
Now, I wouldn't say that's per se a bad thing. There's bad aspects to it, like it denies a lot of women the ability to prove themselves, right? And the other issue that some of you guys may not have noticed is that, let's say in that situation, you're perfectly capable of lifting whatever heavy object you need to, right? That's great. What if there's some skinny guy who's incapable of doing so? Would he get the same help? He wouldn't. So this all goes back to the whole thing about teamwork. And if we're all willing to drop what we're doing and go help a girl lift a heavy object, let's also do it for this skinny 5'4" guy that weighs 100 pounds soaking wet, eh? Because I used to be that guy myself, and I sure as heck didn't get that help. Thank God I hit puberty. But to answer your question, yes, nurture, and also we can unnurture things, right? We're social animals, we're capable of learning. Like I said, it won't take one generation. But I think if we do it properly, you can teach the next generation of males to help everybody, right? It's not that we should just stop helping girls. We have to. We should help anybody that needs a hand. We also need to pay attention to those males that, like I said earlier, are traditionally forgotten. The weaker ones, the skinnier ones, the shorter ones, the uglier ones, you know, the ones that just don't have that amount of social support or acceptance. And I don't care what they look like. I don't care what their personality is. I don't care what their social situation is. I only care that they're getting the help they need and they have the opportunity to grow up to be productive members of society. We have so much more to gain if they grow up to become good men than if they go wrong and shoot up another school. That's just my take on it. I saw a question over there. Yes?
Older males unconsciously want the skinny guy to lift it himself because we want him to get stronger. Unconsciously, there's programming there, I think. to both of you, because you posed the issue, he commented on it, and so it's a triangle. I'm sorry.
Well, I'll answer first and I'll direct it back to you. In that aspect, I think, yes, you should encourage the guy to attempt it on his own, but if it's clearly like disproportionate, like the guy's struggling beyond belief to do it, then give him a hand, right? And it's not just lifting physical objects. Lifting weights is one of the easiest things you can do. Pick something heavy up, you raise it up, and you put it back down. Forgive my language, it's shit simple. Right? What's hard is picking up mental burdens and emotional burdens and putting them somewhere where they can't do any harm, or even better, resolving them. All right, and in that aspect, this is not something you can leave on your own. Why? Because of self-doubt. You can never know if you've solved your mental issues. You don't know. You need that reassurance. You need that confirmation. I can tell myself over and over and over again that I have no reason to be anxious. But as soon as somebody reassures me that, yes, you don't have a reason to be anxious, everything's going to be okay. It gets so much better, right? So if we're going to adapt this to the whole skinny guy lifting the weight problem, let him attempt it on its own, but help him on the way there. And eventually, through repeated tries, he's going to get it on his own. He's going to grow those muscles. And if we take it back to the mental realm, he's going to have that mental fortitude to help himself. And then he can help other people. So we're in the business of encouraging self-sufficiency, but through helping others. If you want to respond to that, you're free.
I think it could be some other guys are wanting to help him be his own man or whatever. But I think it's the wrong way to do it because while the little guy is struggling to lift the object, he knows that other men are watching him, and failure is not an option apparently, so he's going to feel the humiliation. And the failure is going to hang in the back of his mind. The mistakes hang back, and he could gravitate away from the achievement. Maybe he will just sneak away from the heavy objects and someone else does it for him because he doesn't want to fail again.
We're less forgiving of male weakness.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful point, actually. We are much less forgiving of male weakness. We place a heavy emphasis on males being strong, males being dominant, and so forth, and males having the know-how to persevere throughout all situations. And we forget that while we are men, we are also human beings, and forgive my language once again, we fuck up. Plain and simple, we screw up, and when we come to a society that kind of sees us as infallible, that's not good. And like I said earlier, we kind of have this notion that failure is not an option. I've told you repeatedly, failure is always an option, and it's a choice. And I'm going to leave it at that because I think that point's been hammered into the ground for quite a lot.
This is actually the question we research more about equality and especially men's rights. Would you hire a male babysitter for your child?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But do you think there's a stigma against it in society?
There is, and the fault of two things. One, it's a personal fault of the men who choose to do these horrific things. But it's also the fault of the media who overblows these statistics disproportionately, right? We also see that, in fact, I'm going to use an example of a female teacher molesting her students in school. Doesn't receive as much media coverage, not nearly as negative, and a lot of the reactions to it are, not what you'd expect. I would most certainly hire a male babysitter for my children. I think they make an excellent father figure if I am not present. Obviously, I screen them carefully, but if I do the same thing as if I hired a female babysitter, right? That's equality. I screen them both carefully and make sure they have the necessary qualifications without regard for gender. And that's what we're all about here, right? Canadian Association for Equality. I'm vested in what is best for my son or daughter in that context. And if I think that in this context, a male babysitter will provide it better than the female babysitter competing, I will pick him. If I think she'll do better, I'll pick her, right? There's some issues that don't need to be made a gender issue. It's more of a merit-based. Questions? Yes, all the way in the back.
This actually goes to that babysitter. So, in my opinion, is that it really would depend on the age of the kid. Like, if it's a younger kid, I think it's better to have more of a mother figure, so I would get a female babysitter. If they're older, I'd have the male one. I just kind of want to know your opinions on, going that route. Because you remember, you were talking about how it's super important to have a father figure, right? But it's also super important to have a mother figure. And that's what I think that with the babysitter thing.
Well, in this case,
You're gonna have to make a choice in the end, right? And maternal figures are just as important. It's a balancing act. So in this case, it really amounts to nothing more than a coin toss, right? If we place father figures and mother figures on the same equal footing, and we agree that they're both equally important for child development, and I want to pick one to be my babysitter, if I can't hire both, obviously I have to flip a coin and hire one, right? Absolutely. I think both are highly necessary, and in the context, you just have to pick one, and that goes down to the choice you have as a parent and the kinds of decisions you have to make when you're raising your child. I don't think that anybody should be able to judge the choices a parent makes as long as they fall within legal boundaries, obviously. But the way you bring up your child is a highly, highly autonomous task, and as a big supporter of individual freedom and free speech, I think it's important that parents have the discretion to choose, but yeah, great point.
Still assumes that the primary caregiver is always the female.
Good question.
They make the assumption. It comes up automatically, the box is checked off.
This is
I like to call it a temporal issue. We see back then in history, there's always been this concept called the tender years doctrine, where it was an assumption that the mother figure was a better caregiver for the child on account of the fact that she was the primary nurturer. She was the one who stayed with the kid. What I not really take it through the legal is that feeding that to show like in that the excellent caregivers to overcome this issue. It's not through red tape and bureaucracy in the courts. It's through changing the societal attitude that we cannot be caregivers and we cannot adequately raise children, when in fact we can. If we truly are equal, women can be just as good of a breadwinner and wage earner as we can, and we can sure as hell be as good of a parent as they can we not? We need to show the world that we are capable of raising healthy, productive children in much the same capacity as a female can do, barring any differences in biology. And I think that's what's important. One more question in the back.
Yeah, I'd like to focus on equality, because you know, you can take equality, and that's really what the greater society is trying to do, to de-sex society, to make women not feminine, to make men not masculine. And so I think it's important not to assume that it's all nurture and no nature. Like, there's a lot of, I've raised 2 children. One Christmas we bought a doll for the boy and a fire truck for the girl, and they were not in a lot of contact with the outside world. We lived rurally. They traded within about 12 hours. I just tell that because it kind of dropped our jaw. Like, wow, how did that happen? There's got to be meaning to nature, or else, or this whole effort is meaningless. If there are not real differences, and differences that are worth supporting between the sexes, then we go into a society that I will be glad not to be part of.
I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. The basis for my talk was not only about equality, but also about the unique differences that men have and why it causes our issues to be different. Nature plays a big role, certainly, and the way I would think of it as, instead of emphasizing nurture too much, perhaps we can promote nature in a more positive light. So for many of these, per se, natural traits of boys, like being more aggressive, being more assertive, being more physical, we can talk about them in a positive light that gives meaning to how it can be useful for their growth, rather than as simple black and white traits that are different from girls. And obviously, when you phrase it in black and white, one side's always going to look negative. And in this case, the female traits of nurture, being caring, empathetic, they tend to be viewed in a more positive light than being aggressive and so forth. So I think my response to your question there is, I think that, yeah, we need to emphasize nature, but in a positive manner. We need to make it known that not all of these natural male traits are per se bad. Some of these are good, and a lot of these have resulted in great achievements throughout history. Well, thank you for your questions, ladies and gentlemen. I'll hand it over.
So that wraps up our questions, and please give another round of applause for Tony.